Hey, welcome back, everybody. 1 p.m. on the button. I still have the recording going. So those that are just joining us, welcome to IH Research Week 2022. Please know that we are in webinar mode for the first ever podcast broadcast from the IH, or with the IH Research Department, I should say. So if you would like to chat at any time, please use the chat box, and note that reactions are usable. So the reactions are, if you're technologically challenged like myself, those are the emojis that you can send out. So it's truly an honor and pleasure to introduce this podcast session titled Many Ways of Working on the Same Thing project, presented by Dr. Christopher Horsleaf, project co-lead and Ktunaxa scholar, and Jen Driscoll, IH Regional Harm Reduction Coordinator. Thank you both, Christopher and Jen, for being here today and for sharing stories via the podcast. We're very excited.
Hello, Kim and company. Thank you for having us here. And hello, Jen. Thank you for joining us. I'm going off of a little bit of an agenda here because I want to make sure that we do the presentation justice and don't miss out on anything. And the first agenda item up here is a brief introduction by myself. As you just heard Kim mention, my name is Christopher Horsethief. My Indian name is ʔitkinită in the Ktunaxa language. It's only 3 letters, but they're the 3 hardest letters in our language. I live in the southern part of Ktunaxa down here in Spokane Valley, Washington. And I've worked on both sides of the border for a number of tribal communities over the last 30 years, focusing on not only documenting, but also making relevant Indigenous oral histories, stories, our belief systems. And I think it's important to say, not just having them heard, but getting them to stand toe-to-toe equal with the Western systems that we are so often interacting with. Jen?
Thanks, Christopher. Yeah, so I've been learning about introductions and about why we offer them, and really, like, they're different all the time, depending on the audience and the often unspoken expectations of like what you bring. And I could, for the purposes of this podcast, just say the usual. My name is Jen Driscoll. I live in Kimberley on traditional Ktunaxa territory. I work as the Regional Harm Reduction Coordinator for the Health Authority, and my background is in psych nursing. My role supports harm reduction access, education, and advocacy throughout the region. And really, I could just end there. But given that Christopher and I have come here to talk about ʔitkinită, many ways of doing the same thing, I'm going to introduce myself in a different way, in a way that tells you more about who I am, and in a way that's been demonstrated to me by different Indigenous people that I've had the privilege of working with, including Christopher. So to start again, my name is Jen, and I do live on traditional Ktunaxa territory in Kimberley in the East Kootenay region. And I've pretty much lived here my whole life, with the exception of living on the coast for about 5 years in my early 20s, where I went to school. I studied core horticulture very briefly before changing direction to psychiatric nursing. And I get that it's a bit of an odd change of direction, but to make a long story short, it came after a practicum opportunity I had with horticulture, where I worked at a shelter in Nanaimo. And when I worked there, I had the chance to work with the residents out in the garden. And I just really watched and felt people's energies change when they had a chance to work in the garden and to dig and to plant and to harvest. I was super fascinated by this, and also realized that I wanted to spend more time with people that were in crisis and in spaces that supported their growth, and the land was a really observable piece of this. Throughout my career, I've often used plants and gardening as a medium to connect with people on a different level. And while my current role is less about frontline connection, I do look for opportunities to use alternative ways of connecting with people still. And really, it's the people that I've worked with over the years and presently in my professional and personal life that have taught me so much of what I know today. And it's these relationships that keep me moving forward. And I'm always humbled and grateful for what each person has taught me along the way. And my parents and my family are a big part of this. My folks are first generation Canadian, with their parents coming to Canada in like the early 1900s. And my dad's family settled in the Lower Mainland, and my mom's here in the East Kootenay on Ktunaxa territory, near the US border in Kingsgate. They both have Scandinavian heritage, and on my dad's side, some Eastern European background. And I connect mostly with my Scandinavian roots, having grown up with those traditions and like a little bit of the language. But aside from those traditions, my family spent a lot of time and valued really the outdoors. And most of my childhood was really spent in the mountains, or, you know, just camping or whatever. And to this day, like spending time in the natural world is still like an absolute must for me. So even though my family has lived here for at least one full generation, I'm very sad and very embarrassed to say that it's only been in the past, like say 15 years, that I've spent time learning about the first peoples that were from here, the Ktunaxa people in this region. And when I spend time in the mountains now, or just in the forest, like behind my house, I often find myself thinking about the first people here and what it would have been like and how they would have spent their time here and the great deal of care that they took of this place. And so I am truly grateful for the care and do my best to stand in solidarity for this ongoing stewardship. So it's vulnerable and liberating at the same time to introduce myself in this way, even if I'm just sharing just a tiny slivered amount of who I am. Because for the most part, I have this assumption that people really just care about what I do and what I can offer versus who I am. But really, who I am pertains directly to what I do and what I can offer, but also it includes the why. And it's the why and the how part that feels liberating, knowing that I can share with all of you how I got here and who supported me to do this and why I keep moving forward. So I'm going to talk about this a little later, but really this research team has taught me about the value and the power of building relationships and taking time to come into community and just sit down together and just to be. Okay, that's me. I'm going to pass it over to you, Christopher, just to introduce an overview of ʔitkini̔.
Okay. So today we're here talking about our research project, and the name in the Ktunaxa language is ʔitkini̔. It's a little bit of a tricky pronunciation there. There's a uvular fricative X, that sound, and then a voiceless L. It's a little bit of a tricky one to pronounce, but I knew our project was going to be significant and different, as one of the very first things that the project engaged in was a discussion with our language speakers about the best way to describe the project. And the word that we came up with for having this functional equality between Indigenous research of health issues and Western research of health issues was essentially a way in our language of saying they're almost mirror, like they're two sides of the same thing. There's a structural, functional equality from whichever perspective we come to, the Ktunaxa perspective, IH's perspective, any of our research partners or our providers. The goal is we take that deep breath, we engage in a meaningful way, and we start down that discussion together. The ʔitkini̔, or the many ways of working on the same thing research project, is an Indigenous nation-led partnership between the Ktunaxa Nation Council, Interior Health, University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and University of Victoria. All team members and partners share a long-term goal of centering Ktunaxa approaches to supporting health and wellness in Ktunaxa, or as Jen mentioned, the traditional Ktunaxa territory. Under the direction of the ʔitkini̔ advisory group, which is composed of the Ktunaxa Elders, knowledge holders, and our language experts, Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers co-lead our project in the spirit of reconciliation. We have a deep commitment to bringing together researchers, community members, and health system partners for co-learning and co-creation of knowledge, irreducible to either side, not belonging to either side in particular, but jointly constructing, jointly analyzing, and jointly owning the outcomes of the research. The ʔitkiniṭ team is committed to equitable participation of all team members and research partners through investing in building research capacity, upholding Ktunaxa elders and knowledge holders as leaders in problem solving, priority setting, and knowledge production and preservation. It was very important to us that this wasn't another impact analysis where it was people from the outside imposing a system of trying to figure out what was broken with our community. It was a means of integrating deep interests from our people to play an early role in figuring out how we would solve problems, how we would set priorities, and how we would preserve that information. By hiring community members as research personnel and providing training opportunities to Ktunaxa students and junior researchers, our project contributes to mentoring the next generation of Ktunaxa leaders across a wide range of fields, including healthcare, health and wellness, health research, and so forth. The ʔitkiniṭ project is envisioned, guided, and was named by our elders, our knowledge holders, and language experts, who now identify as the ʔitkiniṭ advisory group. It's about 18 people, give or take. Sometimes we have a few more or a few less. And they tend to focus on one of a couple of primary areas, our social systems, including families and health and wellness issues related to families and social systems, and then also cultural, ceremonial, and language experts. They really try and support each other and fill out the group with a great amount of diversity, recognizing everyone's individual contributions. Many of the leaders have lived experience and stories of resilience as residential school survivors and or intergenerational survivors. Additionally, that group brings extensive expertise in experience in research, business, governance, and health. When we look at our sample for that group, we keep a very detailed table. How many of them have went to post-secondary trainings, certifications, which ones have served on council, which one have served in administrative capacities, which of our community members has served as a chief, and also which ones have served on at least one federally funded research project. And I'm happy to report that many of them now have served on as many as 3. We recently got a chance to sit with the Lieutenant Governor for the province to talk about some of the ways that this group is changing Indigenous-led research, and it's always happy to be able to speak on their behalf.
Yeah, so I can speak to the IH partnership and how it's been intentionally limited to the Ktunaxa Nation, as previous research projects that involved multiple culturally diverse Indigenous communities inappropriately imposed pan-Indigenous concepts, which really limited the relevance of Ktunaxa communities. Broad partnerships also fail to honor the Ktunaxa Nation's advanced state of readiness to lead research. And for the Interior Health Partners, our reasoning behind this request was particularly meaningful because it allows for a deeper understanding of how the colonial healthcare system continues to perpetuate inequities and limits culturally appropriate care through pan-Indigenous approaches. So initial gatherings in 2017, which was about a year before my time, I came to be a part of this team in 2018. But these gatherings convened with funding and resources from Interior Health's Aboriginal Health and research teams. And that funding supported the team to do work in ways that respected the local protocols, which included providing meals for gatherings and appropriate compensation for Indigenous knowledge holders. And importantly, this preliminary investment of resources helps us to overcome the inherent catch-22 of grant-based research funding. And I can carry on here and just sort of give my perspective or my story as being part of the research team. And I do want to focus on a gathering that recently took place just this past May, as it was like a pretty pivotal moment for me in terms of my own understanding regarding what equality actually means. But I first want to talk about my experience, just like what it's been like in the past 4 years that I've been engaged with this team, this really incredible team, I should say. So to start, like as I said in the introduction, I'm a psych nurse. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. So a great deal of my time has quite honestly been spent like scratching my head and wondering what everyone was talking about and how it related to the research goals. And I was silent and a lot, occasionally mustering up some courage to ask what I was sure would be a silly question. But not even once were my questions ever met with like impatience or petulance. And after like experimenting a few times with putting myself out there and sharing my experience as just a frontline nurse, I really came to realize that this team, as well as the research, has as much to do with building relationships as it does to the overarching goals. Like relationships have as much to do with the overarching goals. And a respect for and a holding up of each other's knowledge and experience as being equally valuable, which Christopher really just talked about. That really resonates with me as I reflect back on the past 4 years as being part of the team. And if I am honest, I would also say that the team has challenged me and pushed me to think much more deeply about colonization in ways that I'm not sure I would have gotten to otherwise. And I acknowledge that each of us, from a white settler perspective anyway, is at a different stage and place when it comes to the pretty deeply personal work of reconciliation. And Interior Health encourages and really, in fact, insists that all the staff engage in cultural safety courses offered internally. And also I would say that the Health Authority also supports its staff in other cultural learning opportunities as they present. And this is like a really good thing. The content and the shared lived experience is invaluable, and I'm super grateful for that. And I, like many others, have had the opportunity to engage in these learning sessions. And like I say, they've been invaluable for my learning because they provided a chance to begin having conversations about our shared history and the ways in which we can continue to learn truths and think of meaningful ways to engage in the process of reconciliation. But having said that, like integration of knowledge with practice opportunities like don't seem as accessible, or at least at the local level. And maybe I'm wrong about this, or perhaps it's just my experience. But this research team has pushed me to do just this, like to really look for opportunities to integrate the knowledge and practice the actions of reconciliation at a local level. And this really speaks to the research project being intentionally limited to the Ktunaxa Nation and bringing forth those opportunities. But throughout the 4 years, I've often found myself paralyzed, like not wanting to say the wrong thing out of fear that the team would question my belonging, and realize now that this comes really from a place of shame. However, as I continue to work on building relationships, I find myself talking more and challenged no less, for sure. In fact, often more so. But recently I've come to know that and really believe that when I'm challenged or connected, or corrected, I should say, in my thinking, that it's because I'm cared for and my partners want me to grow. So getting back to this past May, we had an in-person meeting with the research team and advisory group. And at this particular meeting, Christopher was working with the elders on some of the language components. Definitions and Ktunaxa words that mean the same thing or similar to the English words that we use. And Christopher, like, please interrupt me if I need correcting here. But first of all, I have to say too that just being in the room and listening to the elders and the Ktunaxa people speaking the language, I am always so taken back and emotional. It is a profound privilege to be a part of this experience, or as a witness to the experience and to the relationships that are happening. Anyways, the elders were struggling to find a Ktunaxa word with similar meaning to the English word. And it was at this moment where there was a realization that Ktunaxa language did not need to stretch and change in order to conform or fit into English, but rather English could stretch to find a way to fit with Ktunaxa meaning. This might seem really like simple, but it was an incredible example validating the Ktunaxa worldview as being equal to the predominant Western worldview. And it highlighted for me how pervasive Western thinking is and how empowering it can be to name it and change direction. It was like a pretty pivotal moment for myself, and I think others on the research team as well. I'll stop there and pass the mic, so to say. Over to you, Chris.
I think when this project originally came about, the other primary investigator who's not on with us today, Sana, had just reached out with an email and said, I've got this idea. I would like to change the way that health research happens. And I'd like to know what kind of a partnership we can work on. And that was very different from many of the other requests that I get. Most of the other requests that I get are, I understand you're the person I'm required to talk to. Here is my theoretical framework. Here are my research questions. This is the manner at which I want to ask them. And if someone comes to us and they already know what they're going to do and what they're going to ask and how they're going to ask it, then they're already thinking about how they're going to do the analysis and write it up in their context. We tell people, don't send us that. If you want to work with us, you have to find some way for us to get on the same page together, which means being open to some of the concerns that community members have. It means also looking at some of the research questions that our community members have and some of our service providers. And it also means semi-structured, open-ended, don't tell us what you're going to do before you get here. That kind of research is just a way of doing stuff to us. That's not a way of doing stuff with us. And from the very beginning, Sana reached out and said, let's change it. Let's change it all. And the first time I went and met with the elders, I said, hey, this one is worth paying attention to. This is somebody that's willing to question any of the practices from top to bottom. And they are asking the very first conversation what things need to change the most. And as we went around the room using a process to us called xaÐ�qanaṭ, or a group solving a problem with one heart, they all kind of put out what their concerns were and what they wanted clarification on. Usually when we ask them a question and someone brings them that top-down, centralized, predetermined impact analysis type research, the elders are not very excited about that. And when we go around the circle, they are almost always focusing on what this person has done wrong and what they need to do to at least get it back on the table. But this time they looked at Sana's request and they said, yeah, first off, the only thing we really want to know is we'd like a few differentiations between healthcare and health research. This is something we want to do. Regardless of what it looks like, the tone was there, the idea was there. So we sent a few messages back and forth from the elders, back to Sana, back and forth. And then at one point, Sana said, okay, well, what's the next step? And I said, the next step is the elders said, you all got to come out here. So we got everyone out to the area, and almost nobody ever comes out and sees us way out in Cranbrook, right? No, if it's not in the Lower Mainland, nobody cares. If you're not immediately adjacent to or in the shadows of UBC or UVic, almost nobody wants to come and spend time, but the team came out and we immediately started changing the way that things happen. One of the first rules was, well, we can't spend money on food. That needs to change. That's a cornerstone of any cooperative project in our community. So hands down, the team said, whatever we need to do to change that, we'll do that. It's not even something we're worried about. But one by one, we started finding a way to remove a lot of these obstacles that left people from our community being interested and engaged to being a little bit taken aback, to being offended, to not even paying attention and being on their devices. The worst thing in our community is when you're presenting to the elders and people are so bored, they're clipping their nails while you're talking. And what we got was this very engaged meeting where they invited everyone in to sit around that circle with them. And as we went around the room, they not only did their introductions before lunch on the first day, but they started asking specific research questions. Let's get to it. Let's find a way to make things better. Let's find a way to get people working on it. It was also at that point that they kind of finalized the name, and they saw that our name could be something that was taking the lead, because as Jen mentioned, it's really common for people to show up in our community and say, here's a phrase that we have that we want to name ourselves. How do you say this in your language? And because of the grammar and the morphosyntactic considerations of our language, we almost never can translate a very simple idea through that black box of language to have a very simple, nice, easily pronounceable name. We had to go all the way back and start looking at a number of higher order considerations in the language. But they were able to do it. And then when we came up with the word and there was a suggestion, we didn't get a research team that said, oh, are you sure? Is there an easier way to, is there a way to do it where there's more English sounds we're comfortable with? Because there really isn't, but we've been asked to do that before. Well, if we do a report, we don't want to have any special characters in it. So what's the closest English we can use? If we're using a QWERTY alphabet, how do we change it enough to fit? But from the beginning, the team was very open to they're non-English sounds. It's a non-English perspective. Another question was around concerns of using the term two-eyed seeing and our philosophical ways. That duality of two eyes or two hearts or two person, that duality, there are some cultural considerations, and we don't actually use the term two-eyed seeing in our community. I understand the practical application, but people took it really well when we said from our ceremonial perspective, that duality of two things, there's a number of important songs and ideas and beliefs that we don't like to mix those together. So it wasn't an idea of making it two-eyed seeing, because really, what are there, 70 languages in BC alone? That's like 71-eyed seeing if you include English, and 72-eyed seeing if you include French. So we started to move away from that into more complex ideas, and the team was supportive at every step. Most recently, and coming out of the discussion at the May meeting that Jen was referencing, we did have that little bit of that aha moment. Why are we switching, trying to make Ktunaxa fit into the round peg? And it was the first time that we told the elders, if we need to change the English terms, let's do it. We have people willing here to talk to us about those things and be supportive. I think just, I know we have 30 minutes here, and I think just in closing, I want to just say that I had the opportunity a few years ago to start working with our local interior health professionals on doing some cultural training up at or at a facility at the hospital in Cranbrook. And that was the first time that I saw that some of the long-term concerns that our community members had about working with interior health were seriously being listened to. It was before the big push for reconciliation, and it was before there were a lot of people competing for this type of funding. But from the beginning, it was a sign to me that interior health was interested in doing this stuff. So Jen, I guess my question to you in closing, can you share your experience prior to this project working with interior health and Indigenous people, and then how that's developed once we started in on our project?
Like, to be honest, I think it's the discomfort that I had felt previous was because of like having some pan-Indigenous information and some like learning a really broad perspective about colonization and about decolonization and reconciliation, but then also having worked in the communities and developed relationships and trying to like reconcile those two things together. And again, it kind of comes back to that paralysis piece and even using the language. Like I've been really even uncomfortable saying like xaZ�qanathi, like there's something about trying out the language that has always felt like, I don't know, wrong to me in some way. Like this sort of, who am I to be able to speak this language? Like knowing that there's been so much history, and part of the colonization process was like stripping the community of language. And then for me to just then start using some words that I've heard or have come across has felt really, really awkward. And even to this day, right, like coming into being part of the research team and you know, the expectation of, yes, this is the name of the project, use the name of the project, but there is this sort of discomfort. And but I think, just going back to your original question, as a nurse, I had the opportunity to work in community and to form relationships. And then the more I you know, learned about that broader perspective, almost the more difficult it was for me to try to figure out, how do I do this work? How do I actually show up in a way that's meaningful? And then this project came along, and I started learning more about like the local information, the local history, and just being a part of, and sitting and just being together. You know, at the meetings, and the meetings where it's, you know, our smaller team, and then when it's the advisory group too, it's just, like I said in part of my story, it's like such a privilege to be there and to witness it. And it is an emotional experience to hear people speaking the language and working together to try to figure it all out together, and seeing those relationships is pretty special. But I would love for you to be able to talk a little bit more about like the appropriateness of using and learning the Ktunaxa language. What you think about that?
I think anytime that people show up to the community and they know they're going to work with this, language is always that thing that people get really nervous about. And trust me, in our community, even people that have lived in the community their whole lives, language was used as that tool of dispossession, and it's really difficult for them. And they get this big kind of stumbling block from a linguistic perspective. We call them affective filters. Stephen Krashen first talked about the role of emotion. When our community members feel all that pressure to learn language and use it, they start focusing on how they're feeling, and they stop focusing on the input. And then they don't really learn from it, and it becomes really stressful. So when we find people that are, one, open to using the language, and two, open to adapting English to those terms, it says something to the rest of the community. It says to them, take a deep breath, let's just shake it out, right? Like, feeling that anxiety about language, and everyone's using it. And it's this idea. There was a period of time where our language was not, we were actively discouraged from teaching it. And now the fact that we can use it, and we can use it as this tool to kind of, again, establish ourselves as being structurally equal or on par with, or standing toe to toe or shoulder to shoulder with English or French or any of the languages in Canada, that says a big thing to the community. Just as much as knowing that when we handed out our findings at our big community meeting, that it happened at a feast. Where at the beginning of the project, we probably wouldn't have been allowed to have a feast, because you can't spend money on food, or you can't do, there were all these little rules about what we could or couldn't do. And we found a way, working together, our project team and the community, the elders from day one, as important as them saying that the language is important, and it's hard for us when people don't use it. And when you use it, it invites us in and helps us to feel comfortable. It's the same thing with food. Traditionally for us, when we get together, you have to have food. If you don't have that food, it's not research, it's not a gathering, it's not a way of supporting one another. So anytime we were able to do any of that kind of work, it was just a really beautiful thing to see some of the research team out digging bitterroot with us at the feast, where we were all handing that food out. We all ate together, and when we were done, that food went to the local homeless shelter, as well as one of the organizations that gives away food in the community. We were able to send, I think, 40 pounds of bitterroot to the different communities and people that couldn't provide for themselves. From beginning to end, language, culture, all of those parts that left us feeling at times underrepresented, became the unit of analysis and a new way of conducting research. It wasn't just gathering data, removing it somewhere else, and then getting a 3-ring binder at the end. Those aren't, we don't read those 3-ring binders. We have hundreds and thousands of them and they never get opened. But here was a team that said, tell us how to say it, tell us what to do, we'll work on it with you, we'll include your questions, we'll go through it together, we'll do the analysis in your community. And then even when we generate the report, it has to work for your community as much as ours. It has to feed your research community as much as our research community meet your goals and outcomes and expectations, just like ours. And then literally at the end, it became this ceremonial feast where we fed everyone. We helped to nourish them. And from our perspective, I've listened to the old ladies telling external researchers that since 1994. And I've had researchers just say, no, we can't do that and we aren't doing it. How do we say this in Latin, right? That was the thing. December 1994, researchers wanted to know how to name something in our language in Latin, and the old ladies got upset and just broke the conversation off, because there's no sense on doing that in a dead language when we're trying desperately to save ours. And here our project comes along and says, what do we need to do to help save this and make it relevant? That's just a 2.5 decade process of trying to get those to change, to get them to be more open, so that people feel more like a valid part of the conversation.
So stumble, keep trying, make mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we've seen some great ones, but everyone always knew, hey, everybody here's working towards the same thing. Our research questions were in it right from the very beginning. So even if something, and there were a couple minor things, there were kind of interpersonal stuff that were going on. Even then, people kind of took a deep breath and were like, okay, this happened, let's talk about it. They didn't like get furious and decide that they were going to shut things down and all. It was the opposite of that. It was, we said this and then this happened. How would we do this traditionally? We'd bring it up and we'd say it again, and then we'd all comment on it so that everyone knew that issue from all sides. And that ended up being really good. At the time, it was a little bit uncomfortable, but it was one of those things where the old people said, there's a way to solve this problem in a traditional means, and it's not shaming someone out or getting mad at them or telling them they have to leave. It's actually working it through and showing, working knowledge systems, again, shoulder to shoulder, looking each other in the eyes, trying to reach the same kind of, human goals. I'm not sure where we are on time here, so I'll take a cue from Kim or someone. I don't know what we're doing. It just has been a good, fun conversation so far.
No, and I know that we've all been very much enjoying it. And I wanted to firstly say to Jen, I appreciated your words of feeling shame and stumbling. I think that's something that I'm learning a lot as I move through as a colonial settler as well. And I feel from my background, I feel tremendous guilt and shame also, because I've just started. I feel like I've definitely just started learning, but I'm about 10 years in, so I feel like there's like Wizard of Oz, the behind the curtain. I feel like I've seen behind the curtain, and you can't go back. And I'm so thankful that I can't go back, but I'm also like learning how to navigate that and what that actually means, and generationally, like what that will mean for my daughter and her generation and the generations to come, and also how that makes my heart feel so much better, knowing that she's learning so much more than I ever did, and learning truth, especially with and Chris, you made mention of the gizmos. I know you can't really see mine, but her having access to information the way she does. She's almost 18. And so her, having knowledge feeds, feeds pop up about true knowledge, such as the 215 children found in Kamloops and ʔitkini̔ territory, and really just learning is what she's wanting to do. And so I'm very thankful for that. There is, made a note of saying to everyone, please feel free to answer or to ask your questions in the chat for Jen and Christopher while we have them for the next 6 minutes. But I'll start off with saying my own question, which is again to Jen. Sorry, I'm going to Jen. So Jen, for when you're wearing your interior health psychiatric nurse hat, how has this this relationship building and work really shaped your day-to-day? I know it's a big question.
It is a big question. And so I don't work, I'm a harm reduction coordinator. So for population health, so my role isn't really in direct client care, but it certainly involves like being in community and doing like lots of work just with my team too. And I think it's just been a constant reminder of like actually checking in with the community, like, you know, harm reduction coordinator. So if we're doing, if there's something related to harm reduction and someone is bringing up, you know, an Indigenous community, well, how do you reach out to that Indigenous community? So I'm definitely drawing on the knowledge that's come from this research team to help our team. And when I'm asked from other teams, even like, well, how, you know, when we're talking about how to appropriately do that, that's coming from this team. A lot of it is coming from this team and what I've gained from, yeah, actually checking in with the community, going to the community, like, do they want this? Do they, you know, especially when it comes to harm reduction? I mean, part of our research is just now starting to look at asking communities, like, what does harm reduction mean to you and to your community? Is that the kind of language that you use? So like asking those questions and not just thinking that, you know, they're thinking in the same way that you are. I don't know, does that answer your question, Kim?
Yeah, for sure. That does. Yeah, just the changing of the whole, like who asked the question? That's what I'm hearing. Yeah, the shift of there. I like it. And so a question from John Grogan, who notes that sharing food is akin to building community and mutual respect. Food becomes a common language. That's what he said firstly. And then his question is, can you relate, and I'll ask it to both of you, can you relate a story of the use of humor during the research?
Yeah, I was looking at that first comment about building community. The old ladies described it to me as 100 years ago, we didn't have the things that we had now. So every little bit that you had was very important. So one of the most important things that you can do is to feed someone. I'd been a vegetarian for like 6 years, very strict. And then the mother of one of the women on our advisory, when I very first met her, she gave me a bowl of deer stew and said, first off, being a vegetarian is incompatible with our cultural way of life, but also understand that this is made with like wild carrots, which are tiny, and wild potatoes. And I want to give you this. I want to help nourish you with this. And just think about 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, how hard that would be when we would cook soup using stones and hides and whatnot. So it always really stuck to me. So thank you, John, for mentioning that. It was one of my very first, like very deep kind of cultural experiences. When it comes to humor, my only real goal as a primary investigator is to make old people laugh, because if they're not laughing, they're probably upset about something. And even when the agenda, even at other meetings, turns into it's time with Christopher, I am automatically going to be joking around with them. Humor as a tool of coping, humor as a cultural tool, humor that was really stamped out at the residential schools. If you don't have a nickname in our community, you should be a little bit worried. And if people give you a nickname, that's like a really big thing. It's always this thing using humor. Whenever I teach, any time I'm working with students, I always talk to them before the presentation after, because I talk about difficult things. I'm the one that shows visual data and historic photos of our social systems and our spirituality just getting pummeled. And I have to do that. I have to be a little bit self-effacing. I have to make jokes at myself and in my interactions. And when I work with community members struggling to learn the basics of the language because they have all of these heavy associations with it, I tell them every story of every time I've ever messed up with the language. When I thought the old lady was asking me if I wanted coffee, and I was like, oh, no, thank you. And then I sat down and all the old ladies started laughing, and later they were like, oh, who does this guy think he is? She was telling you to get her coffee. And then of course they told me the difference between making a statement about getting someone coffee versus the command imperative form. And it was just a really funny thing. So every one of those stories, all of that humor has to come into that, because there's a long history that's difficult. It's terrible. I've seen our elders, myself, our community members break down and cry so many times because we're having to deal with this history and put it into a context that's very different. So if we can do that and use humor as that bridge that carries across, it's always important. And the last time I met with them last Wednesday, I made a big joke about they had all this big, huge spread of food, and no one was eating the tangerines. So I stole all their tangerines so I could eat in my hotel room. And then I posted it all over social media about stealing their tangerines. And they sent me a message and they were like, it wasn't even stealing. We told you could have them. And I said, no, I'm going to tell them all if I get in trouble at the border for having tangerines that the elders said I could bring them. So it's just got to be that kind of humor and that joke. And that's when you know people aren't under this affective yoke, this emotional filter. They're not being shut down. They feel comfortable enough to sit back and take a deep breath and make a joke about something and kind of reset and be on the same level as everyone else. So if you're not joking around, I don't think you're, not to say that it isn't serious research, but you got to do that to get people to breathe and to break up some of that heavier stuff, and to remind us that we can speak our languages now. We can wear our medallions. We can do our research with outsiders. We can be empowered, and we have to take sometimes a relaxing look back at the history, and then just take a deep inhale and kind of exhale all that negativity. And if you can do that while you're also laughing, then that's great.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And thank you, John, for asking that question. And I see we've reached our time. So I want to thank Christopher and Jen for being here today, for sharing your time, your stories, and also being vulnerable with us. And we just thank you so much. Wonderful conversation all around, and it's very appreciated. We'd also like to thank again the elders, Pamela and Gross, for joining us this morning, for Detailer providing our opening, and of course for this podcast session, for the amazing tech supports of the amazingly talented stage runner who's in the background that you can't see, but she's the reason why this is going so smoothly. And last but certainly not least, for everyone that's joined us today, all our attendees, everyone that's registered. We look forward to seeing everybody again tomorrow, and hope you each have a lovely day. Take care of yourself and take care of each other, and we'll meet again tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take good care.